in Buddhism, as Buddhism developed, and the initial Buddhism we know as Theravada Buddhism, really spent a lot of energy, a lot of commitment to keeping the Buddha's teachings, the practices, and the meditations exactly as the Buddha practiced them. My Theravadan teacher, Paul Sayadaw, says that what practices we do of the Theravadan lineage, the tradition that he was the head of, are identical to how the Buddha practiced. I tell people I don't know that for a fact for myself, but I do believe his sincerity in it, and I communicate that is his belief. As Buddhism evolved and emigrated to China from India and Nepal, it first came in by way of the scholars, the philosophers. So the ideas of Buddhism came in and they were examined, discussed in contrast and comparison to the indigenous religions in China of the day, which would have been Confucianism and Taoism principally. And so Buddhism, as it's done in each country it's emigrated to, it's enfolded some of the practices and beliefs of the existing religions or spirituality of the country. And so Taoism and Confucianism, parts of that were folded into Buddhism. And the Buddhists really valued the material that they would get from Indian origin that was considered more sacred than something that was produced in China, which was known to be after the Buddha had died and many years had passed. And so what happened, the historians have revealed, is that some of these documents were written and then they were backdated to put them into a historical context. The Heart Sutra itself began as a kind of a pushback on the scholarly examination of Buddhism. There were practitioners who weren't interested in just studying the sutras, what are called suttas in Theravada Buddhism, and going through the elaborate presentation of the Abhidhamma, also called the Abhidharma. And that's the lists and the organization of Buddhist philosophy and psychology. A very, very technical, very scholarly examination of Buddhism. And so the folks who were interested in practicing began pushing back on the scholarly examination. It wasn't that that was not valued, but people wanted to practice. They wanted to do it for themselves. They wanted to orient towards and walk the path of awakening that the Buddha represented. And so the Prajna Paramita literature came into being. And Prajna Paramita, Prajna is the translates as wisdom, as perfect wisdom. Paramita means perfection. So this would mean perfect wisdom sutra, Heart Sutra. So this is quite an important sutra. And among the Prajna Paramita literature, there's two sutras. One is a longer version of the Heart Sutra, where there's a bit of a preamble and then an epilogue has been added. But the one that we use principally in the Zen tradition is the shorter version. And the Prajna Paramita literature really emphasized sunyata, emptiness, absence, as its core of practice. So this was a departure from the scholarly, from the elaborate practices and lists and ways of approaching meditation and spiritual practice. This was a document, a practice style that was trying to cut through all of the conceptual production that had been offered to explain Buddhism to the day and in that day. And so this sutra has principally two characters, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, which is the Bodhisattva of compassion. Avalokiteshvara is the Indian name. As Buddhism spread, the names were changed in each country. So Avalokiteshvara became Kuan Yin in China and Kanzeon or Kanon in Japan, and other names in other countries. I don't know all the names of those countries. But Avalokiteshvara is speaking to Shariputra, and Shariputra was one of the keenest disciples of the Buddha, somebody who was very experienced and very knowledgeable. And so this is an exchange that they're having. The bodhisattvas in Buddhism are personifications of particular qualities of awakening. For example, Avalokiteshvara, as I mentioned, is the bodhisattva of compassion. So some of the statuary of Avalokiteshvara will show her or him. They're depicted as mostly androgynous. And they'll show Avalokiteshvara with 1,000 arms, and each arm, each hand, holds a different something that is in response to the needs of the world, the cries of the world is the languaging. And so Avalokiteshvara is here to offer loving assistance in whatever form that needs to take. And so as this starts, the first line, Om, excellent prajna paramita Om. So it's just settling in. Om is a term that's used to depict the first sound that's made after the universe came into being. The sound of the silence is one of the words we use as Om for that. So here Avalokiteshvara, deeply steeped in and abiding as Prajnaparamita. So he's not only steeped in this perfect wisdom, he's abiding and functioning as perfect wisdom. And thoroughly beheld the 5 scandas exist as absence. The 5 scandas were one of the ways that the individuality, the me, was positioned in Buddhism. The scandas, or khandas, I believe it's called in Theravada Buddhism, are form, feeling, perception, mental impulses, and consciousness. So form is any form, or formlessness can be form. So it refers to some type of shape or some type of physicality. Generally, again, we can have formlessness in form, so it doesn't quite fit with how I'm describing it, but there's a kind of a physicality, a presence that's discernible with form. Feeling is typically talked about as Vedana in Theravada Buddhism, so there's 3 options: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this is what we assign to each form that we see. We have a reaction, a categorization in response to the form. And then perception is where we begin to put together the form and the feeling and the reaction, the reactivity to it. It begins to take shape in that way when we're getting into perception. Oh, I see what this is. This is my neighbor, and I have this reaction to the neighbor. So it's starting to focus and clarify. And then mental impulses is going to be pointing to thought, concept, any kind of mentalization that's going to go on in relation to identifying, say, this neighbor, how I feel about the neighbor, what thoughts and experiences, memories I have about that is going to be the mental formations or mental impulses. And then finally, consciousness. So awareness with reflective capability. And that was how one of the ways that the me was talked about, the sense of self. And so part of what this is doing is saying that all 5 of the skandhas were existing as absence. They were existing as emptiness, existing outside concept in direct experience. So Avalokiteshvara turns to Shariputra and says to Shariputra, form is absence. He doesn't say form becomes absence. He doesn't say form and absence coexist. He used the word is, so they are the same. Form is absence. Form is emptiness. And goes on to say that emptiness, absence is form. So right now, in existence, emptiness is appearing as form, and form is reflecting emptiness or absence. These are both dynamically happening all the time. And that's what this is calling attention to. So form is not different from absence. Absence is not different from form. They're intertwined, they're codependent, they have a relationship where one can't appear without the other. So the wise perception that absence is not different from form, this wise perception vanquishes conceptual knowing. So when we are in direct experience of form as emptiness, emptiness as form, conceptual knowing opens and drops. So we're beginning to make contact with intuitive knowing, with a deeper knowing that knows from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So it's a different kind of contacting. And Avalokiteshvara goes on, Shariputra, this profound realization is unaffected, unobstructed by all conceptual knowing. By all markers of materiality mentality. Sorry about that. So again, Shariputra, this profound realization is unaffected. So it can't be changed. It's not influenced. It's a reality. It's unobstructed. Nothing gets in the way or blocks by all markers of materiality or mentality. So the markers of materiality would be the physicality of our body, the sense of self, the different ways that we relate and associate to ourselves as an identity. And the materiality would be all the ideas, all the thoughts, all the thinking process. I was surprised at one point. I had a head injury, and I was quite surprised how much identification I had with the way that I thought, the mode of thinking. Because the thoughts, the pattern of thoughts changed after the injury. And it was like I had to relearn how to think in a different way. And it was surprisingly difficult for me with identity. I had this identity that included the manner of thinking, the way I thought. Yeah. So anyway, just to say, when that's disrupted, that can be quite destabilizing to the sense of me, the sense of self. Let me pause here and see if there's any questions or comments. So the unmanifest is going to contain absence, but it's also going to be functioning as peace, stillness, as other qualities as well. And there'll be a vastness and emptiness to it. So the unmanifest has that. That's a chief quality of the unmanifest, is emptiness or absence. But we could say the unmanifest and refer to one of these other functions. So it's not the only quality, but it's, again, a chief quality. From the conditioned viewpoint, from the regular viewpoint of a human, all of those markers would be ways that I identify myself. Everyone identifies themselves. And it's patterned in our families and societies and cultures, so it's reinforced also. It's not exactly completely illusion, meaning there is a reality to it, there is a substance to it, but we use the languaging, it's not ultimate reality, because it's conditioned, it's subject to birth, decay, and death, and what's unconditioned isn't subject to that. So that's one of the ways we distinguish between what we're touching into that really is transcendent, it doesn't have a birth and death, versus what we're touching into that has birth and death and a life cycle. So it's going to be conditioned. We're saying they are made up of emptiness, but what I'm talking about is the perception. that we're experiencing it as emptiness. It's not just an idea, it's an actual visceral feeling or experience of that reality. I mean, we can say it's separate in that if you stub your toe, my toe's not going to hurt. So there is separation, but there's also a unity. We can have experiences in this group that many or all of us can experience at the same time. So there is a connectivity and a transmission, a communication that is happening too on lots of different levels, energetic and in other ways. So we're just recognizing all of that and trying to call attention to the reality of the unconditioned, the unmanifest. I mean, I think that's one of the anatta is one of the big communications that emptiness conveys, impermanence as well. So most of this, and the Prajnaparamita literature and practice is really oriented to the anatta, the no self, that was seen as sort of the important experience to have. And absence and anatta were seen to be very much hand in glove. If you're experiencing the emptiness, the absence, you're probably not going to be doing so from a sense of me. So there is probably going to be an anatta, no self experience in there too. So then we go through the line, Shariputra, form is absence. Again, it's not saying become here, it's is. So form is absence, feeling is absence, perception is absence, mental impulses are absence, consciousness itself is absent. So we're once again saying all the scandas are absent, are empty. No eye, no ear, no tongue, nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no hearing, no smell, no taste, touch. All are realized truths. So the fact that there isn't a me seeing, there's still going to be the perception of sight, and there's still going to be knowing, but it's going to be a combined knowing. It's going to be both the relative and the absolute. The conditioned and the unconditioned are both going to be apparent. And it's not that we treat the conditioned as the more real, we just treat it as a different level of reality, but containing the whole of the absolute. The love, the absence, the presence, the peace, all of this is in every experience or in every perception we can have. So they go through then no form in hearing, no form in smell, no form in taste, no form in touch, no form in sight, no marker of self, and no delusion. Because part of the delusion is taking the self as a substantive something, a me. And then all the functions, the hearing, smell, taste, touch, those also are empty, are absent. But we can still experience we can have all of these senses internally in our meditation. We can hear, touch, taste, smell, our experiences if we have those skills, if the skill sets are activated in our meditation. And it says, each are a deeper truth of absence until no old age or death, and no elimination of old age and death. So we're taking away old age and death because we have the absolute that doesn't have birth and death. It's always in existence. So that takes away birth and death. And that won't die. The absolute, whatever is awake in your experience, in your awareness and consciousness, whatever is awake, I'm meaning whatever is the awakeness of the absolute is not going to die. When that body does die, when that mind ceases, these qualities will not, because they're absolute. They will continue, and they will have whatever trajectory or journey that they have. With nothing to attain, there's no dukkha, no suffering, no causation, no path, No knowing, no gain, no attainment. So this is a really important line. With nothing to attain, that means everything is here. Everything is already in awareness. Everything is already fully present in your world, in you right now. It can't be anywhere else. There's no secret hiding place. There's nothing that I have to give you. There's nothing to be given. We practice by resonation, by being in the same energetic field and feeling the resonance of the absolute. And that's how we connect and we deepen together. So there's no path because we already have all the information we need. There's no knowing. It's not an accumulation of information. There's nothing to gain and there's no attainment. But we have to get to the point where we do have attainment and gain before we can release attainment and gain. So we do have a path. We walk the path. We expect there are certain milestones on the path, certain experiences. But all the experiences are really supporting us putting down all the structuring, putting down our allegiance to the self and to the relative world as the most important truth. So with nothing to attain, the bodhisattvas abide as perfect wisdom, resting and releasing in accord with the supreme knowledge of the unmanifest and the manifest as corresponding, everlasting, and unsurpassed peace. So the manifest and unmanifest are functioning together with a wisdom that we can't fully perceive, in accordance with the supreme knowledge of the unmanifest and manifest functioning together in everlasting and an unsurpassed peace. So everlasting, always going to be in existence, and unsurpassed peace. So quite a line. Let me check in again and see if there's any questions. Anything I can explain more thoroughly or clearly? I think both are true. I think there's a releasing that's happening, a releasing of identity and description. There's that letting go. And I think there's also a kind of accumulation. I think there are experiences that we can confirm and validate. But each of the experiences is also a releasing, a letting go of the markers of me, a letting go of the scandas a little more, and gaining experience in the relationship between love and absence. But it's also the real-time recognition, not constantly, but regularly, of the emptiness and the love manifesting the whole of the conditioned world. So that's part of what this is communicating, the Heart Sutra, is yes, everything is empty and there's nothing to attain or get or experience, and yet there are things to gain and experience and get until we see through those as being substantial, because we have a hierarchy. Awakening is better than delusion, is a kind of an inbred position we have in Buddhism. And yes, that's true, but only to the point that the awakening reveals the delusion as false, as empty, and I mean empty without substance. It's not the physicality, the reality we take it for. That's the realization. Then it can all be put down. So it's we're a little bit contradictory, saying there's no experience and yet there is experience. But there's experience only until we experience no experience. Yeah, I see the point that suffering is conditioned at birth, meaning there's this physical body, and we're going to have disappointment. We're going to have a certain amount of pain and failure throughout our life. I mean, all humans experience that. So that's what that's pointing to. And when we take that as our primary reality, then this is our world. And this is why people are motivated to get ahead, sometimes at others' expense. Because there's only so much resources. I need to accumulate them. If you don't get enough, yeah, I'm sorry about that, but I need more. So it starts that level of suffering. But the suffering also comes in from the structuring of the identity of the me. Because implicit in that is we turn away from our direct contact with the absolute. We do it knowingly because we must invest in our birth family, our early caregivers, and our society. That's where our survival depends on it, is our perception. So we have that knowing. It's for the baby, it's not an awake knowing, meaning they didn't come from a sense of self as we do, transcend the self to have this experience, this viewpoint. They were born into it. So we don't consider it the same as awakening for that reasoning, but the viewpoint is similar. And so this is what starts the suffering also, is the identity, the me. Now there's a me to protect and a me to make sure you see. I want you to mirror me exactly as I see me in my highest self. And if you do, then I really like you. And I think you're so smart. And if you don't, I think you're the dumbest person in the world. You don't get me. I don't want to hang around with you. And this is how we function in our life in more sophisticated ways than I'm saying. But yeah, so this is where the suffering is, and this is why there's really a tie-in between the prajnaparamita and no self and the emptiness and absence experiences. Because when we have that no self experience, we are opening to the absolute. Whether it's kind of how deep an opening it is, that depends on a lot of variables. But I think that's why it's positioned as it is. So therefore, Shariputra, with nothing to attain, bodhisattvas abide as prajnaparamita. I just love that line. They abide as it. So they're not saying they have this perspective or they function. They're simply abiding. They're living this perfect wisdom that the self is a creation, a structuring. We take all these photographs and we do, I don't know if you did this when you were kids, but we used to do it. We take these still photographs and put them in a certain order and then flip them in our hand, and it made it look like a bit of a movie. You can see the pictures progressing, some type of movement. And that's what this is like, our world. That's the abiding as prajnaparamita, is getting that all of these pieces of the me, the form, the feeling, the impulses, perception, all of that, we're putting all the pieces together and saying, this is a thing. This is me. And it's simply a construction of all the ideas, all the mirroring we've received, all the physicality we identify with. And that all becomes the sense of self that we're functioning with. And remember, we're trying to get everybody else to see us, to recognize us in this way while we accumulate as much stuff as we can. This is the goal of most humans. And abiding as prajnaparamita is not that. It's living in the truth that absence is form and form is absence. In the perfection of time. That's a great line too. So what's the perfection of time? Perfection of time would be no time. It would be all time. Because in the viewpoint from the absolute, there is no past or future. Those are mental constructs. There's only this present moment. This is always where we live. This is always where we're functioning, in this same moment. And so this is the perfection of time. All Buddhas exude prajnaparamita in impeccable measure. So all of these deeply realized beings that are abiding in prajnaparamita in impeccable measure, skillfully warm-hearted. The unmanifest of absence reveals and liberates any reliance on realization or identity with awakening. So even here, we're taking away, the prajnaparamita is taking away awakening. We're taking away that the unmanifest reveals and liberates any reliance on realization or awakening. So even that gets taken away, because once we have the experience, we can have an ongoing experience. But for most of us, we have an experience, we then package it and we put it in a certain place. And this has been my experience. And this is where I am. So even with awakening, we can establish an identity. We can now become this person who's had one or more awakenings and understands this truth or that truth. And so that again can become a way that we mark ourselves. And that's why this is important to take that away. We need to liberate any reliance on realization, any idea that there's anywhere to get, anything to get. But we only realize it, unfortunately, by getting, by pursuing these things, having these realizations. And that's when we realize, oh, they're opening the door to an accurate perception. And they're helping us release whatever's inaccurate, inauthentic. In the unchanging three worlds, every Buddha abides as Prajnaparamita, expressing incomparable, authentic awakeness. So abiding in this truth, we've been talking about, that the absence, the emptiness, and the presence and the love all form all reality. And yet there's no identity to be had. There's no me that's actually here. There's this composition of parts and pieces and understandings. Usually they use the three worlds. They can talk about it as past, present, and future. Sometimes they're used to point to other realities. They might point to the human realm. They might point to some type of, the absolute or some other realm. So they're looking at different things, but typically it's the time periods of past, present, and future. And so then it goes into, be clear that Prajnaparamita is a great mantra, an all-knowing protective mantra. And therefore know the unconditioned Prajnaparamita, the knowing mantra, the protective mantra, is an immaculate mantra that preserves and confirms authentic truth. So by this mantra that we can chant, we're not only expressing this wonderful mantra, this important communication, but it's a mantra that preserves and confirms authentic truth. So in itself, it's not only accurate, but it's also supporting this accurate viewpoint. And then the mantra is Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhisvaha, which is repeated. And that, as I've said, the translation is going, thoroughly, completely gone, awakening, may it be so. So it's going means letting go, releasing all of our opinions, all of our understanding, all of our identity, the scandas, all the markers of me that we have. It's letting all of that go and being willing to be completely gone, being willing to be completely the experience of absence or emptiness. And that in itself is the validation of awakening in its purity and simplicity.